influences of these changes to us, people, our disciplines, and our nations. Our China Lunch lectures and the discussions help us to exchange with us researchers, with practitioners, and our motivation is to get to know each other and our disciplines and our ideas and research results better. In this seminar, we are looking at circular economy, especially, and its influence on the climate and the behavior of its people. Our speaker today is Professor Madlen Kobi from the University of Freiburg. Warm welcome, Professor Kobi. We are here that you are. We're happy that you are here, of course, and your talk today is about energy transition, decarbonization, and thermal material culture in Chongqing. What is the China Lunch and why do we call it China Lunch? Maybe you remember, like Miro and others who visited us in former time, we really had a lunch after the discussion from a nice Chinese cook. Then we thought, okay, how can we still call it China Lunch? And we thought about that we invite you to cook for yourself and we send you a recipe. And that's what we did today. And we are always asking our lecturer, what is your favorite dish on the Chinese table? And Ms. Kobi sent it in or said that her favorite dish is tangyuan, glutinous rice balls with black sesame. Very good choice. I like this dish too. You all know that this China Lunch series is part of our Urbanics network. Here you see it here, Urbanics network, running for how many? 4 years already, I think. And we found more than 1,000 alumni who are joining or joined this network already. And it's a whole variety and very diverse team. And we're very happy that this is still growing. And then we all find new friends, like today, another Madlen is here, Madlen Palke and others. So very much welcome and please become part of our Urbanics network. We would be delighted. To our team, as you can easily realize, is belonging Tanja Becker. We all have the same background, Paul Hoffmann, Zhou Homeng, and Kimbese and me. And now I'm handing over to others of the team. Welcome.
So now I would shortly introduce Professor Kobi a little bit. Today, Professor Madlen Kobi's research and teaching focus on architecture, anthropology, urbanization, infrastructure, waste, and circular economies, with a regional focus on China, where she has conducted anthropological research since 2009. And in 2014, she obtained her PhD from the Institute of Social Anthropology at the University of Bern, with a thesis on Han-Uyghur relations in rapidly urbanizing areas in Xinjiang, China. After that, she worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Zurich and at the Academy of Architecture in Montreal, Switzerland, where she has primarily investigated the relations between architecture, social technical knowledge, and everyday climate-related practices in residential spaces in Chongqing, also in China. In January 2022, she will start her position as assistant professor at the University of Social Anthropology at Freiburg, Switzerland, with a research project focusing on the reuse of building materials in contemporary European architecture. So dear Professor Kobi, we are very glad to have you here today and very looking forward to your presentation about burning for cooling, energy transition, decarbonization, and thermal material culture in Chongqing, and the discussion afterwards. So thank you in advance, and the stage is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for this kind introduction and also generally for inviting me to give a talk in your great series. I didn't attend many lectures yet, but I remember that the first lecture I attended was in January this year in January, the talk by Stefan Schirmer on the passive house in China, because this is a topic that very much related to my own research. And I was glad to see that there are like experts in the German-speaking academia working on topics like that. So as you kindly introduced me, I will become a professor, or I will start my position as a professor in January. And actually my new project is much more about circular economy than my old one, because I will deal with the reuse of building materials. But today I will talk about the research I conducted during the last 5 years. And it's on thermal material culture and energy transition in Chongqing. In the last 2 decades, we've heard a lot of alarming reports about the high air pollution in Chinese cities. And the high levels of PM2.5 particles, they harm the everyday life of urban residents in China a lot. Many stay at home if the levels are high. And also we hear that children are not allowed to play outdoors anymore. So air pollution is a serious risk for urban residents. This is mainly due to energy being produced by coal. And of course, in recent years, hydropower and other forms of renewable energy production are gaining terrain in China and also elsewhere, of course, to replace coal as a main and cheap energy resource. Meanwhile, in Chinese cities and elsewhere around the world, people are spending the hot summers indoor, using their air conditioning machines, and these make the summer bearable. Especially the weaker parts of the population, the elderly and the children, they are happy to retrieve to the indoors where you have cool air and where you can also filter the air and create a healthy environment. Rather than seeing all these different aspects of contemporary urban life as happening independently, I will outline today that the thermal material culture of cooling is not only a means to regulate one's body temperature, but that it is spatially embedded in energy infrastructure networks. My findings are based primarily on 4 months of ethnographic research that I conducted in Chongqing in 2017. But I also did some oral history and researched materials on policy-related materials, but also historical materials on how architecture developed in the last 6 decades. I will outline that thermal modernity and energy transition in China are intertwined with huge climatic and sociopolitical challenges. And I also want to make aware how these everyday decisions of residents to keep cool are embedded in a larger political and economic setting, and also how the indoors and the outdoors are related climatically. My talk today is structured in 2 parts. So the first part is a very ethnographic part. It's a short history of cooling in Chongqing. I will mainly talk about how cooling happened before electrification and how it happens today since electrification and also after the economic reforms of the 1980s. And in the second part, I will look at how cooling is embedded in infrastructure networks, talking a bit about hydropower as a form of decarbonization, also addressing urban climate justice, and giving you a short excursus on energy consumption in winter. And at the end, I will conclude by mentioning what I mean with circularity effects in urban climate research. Many of you may know Chongqing. It is located in the southwest of China on the banks of the Yangtze River. And at the end of the 19th century, it was an important port city. So traders were trading salt and fruits and timber towards the eastern part of China. Within China, Chongqing belongs to the so-called summer hot, winter cold. zone, and it has a subtropical climate. Temperatures in July and August, during the hottest summer months, they reach an average of 33 degrees, but they often climb to 40 degrees or more. Chongqing residents all agree that summer is painful. 受不了也要受. So even if one cannot bear it, one has to bear it somehow. This is not only related to the high temperatures during daytime, but also at night, temperatures rarely go below 30 degrees Celsius. In addition, the high humidity of 80% all year around makes the heat feel very sticky. A widespread rumor says that actually temperatures in summer are often climbing over 40 degrees Celsius, but the government often does not publish the real numbers, because if it would be over 40 degrees, it would count as a heat day and people would not have to go to work anymore, and also children would not have to go to school anymore. So it would be an economic loss. Therefore, the rumor says temperatures are often indicated as 38 or 39 degrees Celsius. So how do you keep cool in this hot and sticky climate? Until the mid-20th century, Chongqing's building stock was dominated by the popular residential forms of houses on stilts. So these were dwellings constructed of wood and later of bricks. And the houses took advantage of the microclimatic conditions along the riverside, where ventilation was facilitated through cold air moving uphill from the river. In addition, you see here a house on the upper right side. The houses had breathable bamboo walls. So this helped to combat the high humidity. The stilted houses were then more and more replaced by socialist houses and later also by high-rise buildings. For me, it is interesting to look at the building practices in the socialist period after the 1950s, because this was a time when passive means of cooling were much more important due to the non-electrification of the housing stock. On these images, you see the buildings of a residential compound, which is part of the arts school. It's called the Xiaomeishu Xueyuan, and it dates back to the socialist time. In the 50s, these one-story buildings were constructed for the workers of the work unit of the art school. And later in the 1970s and 80s, they were replaced with buildings of 4 to 6 stories, which were built out of brick walls and also prefabricated concrete floors. For indoor climate control, these socialist buildings, like those here in the Xiaomeishu Xueyuan, but also other types of buildings from that period, they really used a lot of passive means to regulate climate. For example, they included different apertures, openings in the walls. They often had, you can see it here mainly. Do you see my mouse? Okay, so they often had double T-shaped houses like this, which facilitated the ventilation, and because they maximized the exterior wall surface. And also the staircases were often constructed on the building's west side, where to prevent the strong afternoon sun heating up the apartments. This was a small project that I did in the neighborhood. I was mapping the different patterns that were generated during that period. So most of the patterns I copied from staircases. You see they were always open and they arranged the bricks very creatively in different patterns. My informants who lived in these buildings during that period, so in the 70s and 80s, they said that the most pleasant place was always outdoors in the shadowed spaces of the compound. I mean, you see here in the middle, it is a very subtropical climate, and it was, with a lot of trees between the houses. So people used to gather there during the hot summers. They took out the bamboo beds, the bamboo mats, and other furniture, and cooled down collectively in these semi-public places. Those residents who slept indoors, they used to spread water on the floor because through the evaporation, the air would cool down a bit. Many also slept on the floor during that time and not on the bed because it was a bit cooler. After the 80s and electrification, more and more people purchased electric fans, later window air conditioning, and from the 90s on, the split unit air conditioning became the most common one. Interestingly, there was a period in the 70s when the government also provided collectively used cooling rooms. So there was some electricity available, but not for the ordinary citizens. So the work unit provided, for example, these collective recreation rooms that you see on the right-hand side, or also communal cold storages as the one on the right-hand side, where fish or meat was stored and people would just go there to get this food because they didn't have individual refrigerators. So some of these buildings still exist. These photographs here were taken in 2020. But of course, they are repurposed nowadays or are standing vacant. The change of thermal summer practices in Chongqing since the 1980s has also affected social relations. The locally used term for enjoying the cool of the shade does not only imply to cool oneself down, but it is related to a kind of collective activity beyond the family in public spaces. So practices like co-sleeping on the rooftops or sitting together under the trees go beyond the search for thermal comfort. They were embedded in the social life of the compound, in gossiping or communal cooking. This gathering of neighbors outdoors has largely vanished in the more vertically oriented high-rise compounds where people can cool down their own apartments. This is more or less the situation today. The cooling down in the indoors has gained relevance, and concrete sheltered apartments replaced the older socialist architecture, or they coexist in today's city space. Between 2002 and 2012, the number of air conditioning units per household has doubled from 1 to 2 units. So the possibility to access relatively affordable household electricity services shifted the summer practices towards the indoors. Not only in private areas, but also in commercial and public spaces, air-conditioned spaces became the most common. So on the left-hand side, you see a small restaurant, which writes really on the window that the air conditioning is on, or what everyone knows, the shopping malls, of course, they are also cooled and people would go there for a walk because it's more pleasant than walking outdoors. Exemplary for today's cooling practices is the example of the family of Wang Tong that I visited in 2017. So she's a landscape architect in her 30s, and she lives with her parents in one of these new high-rise residential compounds. When I visited her, the first transition was from the hot outdoors to the half-dark lobby, which was already a thermal relief to the body. Then we went up to the 27th floor and we crossed a corridor and then entered the family's bright 3-room apartment. The 2 humming ventilators in the living room, they distributed some cold air emitted by the in-ceiling built-in air conditioning unit. So this is the setting. We came in through the main door, and this is the living room with the built-in air conditioning. And here was a fan that distributed the cold air in the whole living room. The rhythm of when and what kind of cooling devices the family uses depends on the daily activities in the different rooms. So Tong explained to me, apart from the built-in air conditioning, we have an air conditioning unit in every room. When cooling the living room, we close the doors to the bedrooms. So these doors and these doors are all closed. When we leave the apartment, we turn off all devices. I often cool down my room for 1 to 2 hours before bedtime, and then I turn it off again before falling asleep. So you see a lot of electric or different electric devices are being used, but also passive means of cooling are still in place. For example, the apartment is facing towards the east where the sun is rising, and they have here a huge window front, and they put a thick curtain there in order to prevent the morning sun heating up the apartment. So passive and active means of climate control are combined to keep cool in this apartment. A lot of research has been conducted on cooling the indoors around the world, and cooling down one's apartment seems to be part of what we conceive as a modern urban lifestyle. But this way of creating spaces has huge environmental and also socio-political implications that I'm now going to explore in the second part of the presentation. Urban energy consumption with air conditioning consisting a large part of it, I will come back to some numbers later on, is related to different aspects of the energy infrastructure network. For example, it is related to state governance. What is the preferred energy being used? How is it distributed physically? What is the infrastructure? What are the environmental impacts that are taken into account in order to provide cheap energy, for example? Electricity pricing is an important point in China because China keeps electricity prices relatively low. Price fluctuations for coal, for example, are not passed on to the end consumers. And Chongqing, for example, in order to guarantee a steady energy supply, imports energy from different regions within China, from the northwest, from north, and also central China. So it is a huge national network that provides individual cities with enough electricity to make these air conditioning units running. And of course, urban energy consumption is also related to the energy producing industries in the hinterlands. How can the state or companies provide the electricity, or how is the energy logistics working from the raw material to the consumption places of electricity? Coal is the backbone of China's industry, as we all know. In 2018, coal accounted for some 67% of the share in the national electricity mix. And 1 of every 4 tons used globally is burned to produce electricity in China. So coal seems indispensable to satisfy the rising living standards in Chinese cities, which includes the cooling and heating of the indoors. Decarbonization and the need to rethink energy production have become a pressing issue for the Chinese government. In 2020, President Xi Jinping made ambitious commitments. First, to bring China's coal emissions to peak before 2030, and second, to make China carbon neutral by 2060. So this is a bit the background of how electricity is being produced in China. And these aspects of energy governance are, of course, rather invisible to the daily consumer of cooled indoors. But the massive use of air conditioning devices also has an impact on the local urban climate. And this local urban climate is perceivable by all of the residents in Chinese cities. There are 2 effects that I would like to discuss now. One is the heating up of the urban air, and the second one is air pollution. So in Chongqing, for example, the temperature difference between the dense urban areas and the surrounding rural areas is almost 10 degrees. On the one hand, this is related to air conditioning, but of course, it's also related to urbanization in general, to the tarmac roads and the concrete buildings which store heat, and to the loss of green spaces which used to mitigate the heat. It is a vicious circle, and here we have one aspect of circularity. The more that urban residents switch on their air conditioning units, the more heat is emitted towards the outdoors, thus further contributing to urban heat island effects. And the increase of hot days, on the other hand, propels the retreat towards the cooled indoors. So it's really a vicious circle. Many informants, they think that the summer months in Chongqing are actually getting hotter, and I did some research on that and realized that statistical measurements back up this thinking. 2013 was the hottest summer ever recorded, and actually since 2009, media have reported a new electricity consumption record almost every season. So this trend is clearly related to the air-conditioned indoors. Urban heat significantly affects the health of urban residents, especially during heat waves. The mortality rate is higher than usual, and in general, it of course has an impact on the body's metabolism, again, especially for elderly residents and children. Another effect is urban air pollution. Electricity production, as I mentioned, is closely related to coal being burned, and it is linked to deteriorating air quality. Coal-generated electricity is mainly consumed in urban areas and in industries. So on the right-hand side, you see a bit the PM2.5 air pollution concentrations, and you clearly see that urban areas have the highest levels of PM2.5 particles. Maybe some more numbers. This table shows that the major sources for air pollution are traffic congestion, energy production, and consumption. And the emissions are rising since the 1990s. In particular, we find an increase in the consumption of electricity and heat. This table only goes until 2009. So here are some more recent numbers from 2018. In 2018, 46% of the total energy-related CO2 emissions in China fell on the electricity and heating sector, followed by industry. This includes coal, steel, and cement industry, and also transportation. Here, particularly, the deficient air filters make the CO2 emissions rise. There are some other factors which are here, and the data is from Climate Transparency. Urban inhabitants' health was severely affected by air pollution up until the 2000s, and because many electricity plants were located in urban areas. Since then, a number of government measures all over China, often forced by NGOs and civil society movements, they have worked to curb pollution from coal production. And many factories and power plants in urban centers have been closed or relocated to suburban areas. Here you see the inner center of Chongqing with the Chongqing cement plant. I think the photograph must be from around the 1970s. And this plant was closed only in the 1990s or relocated to the suburban areas. So here you literally see the pollution created by the industry in the center. In Chongqing, also a clean energy movement was launched in the year 2000. So it's a policy that accepts the necessity of coal-produced electricity, but at the same time, it wants to invest in cleaner technologies and lowering the consumption of sulfur content coal and develop alternative energy sources. Now, maybe a few words about hydropower, because this is often mentioned as a way towards decarbonization. Since the 2000s, many forms of non-fossil energy production in China have increased, such as hydro, nuclear, wind, and solar energy. But in the same time, also the consumption of coal and petroleum has been rising. Chongqing is one of the regions within China that can make use of its abundant water territory, or of its water abundant territory. Already now, about 30% of the energy stem from hydropower, because not only the Yangtze River, but also the Jialing River are being used to produce electricity. The Three Gorges Dam that you see on the picture here is known to all of us, and it started operation in 2012 as the world's largest hydroelectric power station. Its electricity is, however, not only transferred to Chongqing, but mainly to metropolitan areas in the east, so Shanghai and Guangzhou. One part is also delivered to cities in the surroundings, such as Chongqing, Wuhan, and Chengdu. Of course, this hydropower production causes less air pollution, but the construction and maintenance of the Three Gorges Dam has had other serious environmental and social consequences. There was the flooding of ecosystems, the extinction of species, and new sedimentation dynamics in its basin, which are hard to control. In addition, the flooding of human settlements caused the relocation of 1.1 million inhabitants of the region. So these are some of the ecological and social damages which are also caused by the post-carbon energy strategy. And they seriously call into question whether that is a clean path towards the future. At the same time, another question remains open, namely whether the Chinese energy sector can supply enough renewable energy to meet the rising energy demands in the future. Now, going back a bit more to the everyday life in Chongqing, urban decarbonization policies, such as the relocation of polluting industries to the hinterland, of course, they benefit all urban residents equally. If the air gets cleaner, everyone can benefit. At the same time, there is a difference in how people can cope with the heated up urban climate. The necessity to use air conditioning has led to a socioeconomic stratification within Chinese urban society. Earlier, so the time before electrification, everyone of the same work unit used to spend the summer evenings outdoors together, from the cook to the professor. People were collectively enduring the heat. But today, the power of money more and more decides whether someone is able to cool down the apartment or also heat it up, as I will come back a bit later. Middle-class families, such as the one that I described earlier, Tung's family, they consciously use their electric devices to save energy costs. So we heard in this quote that I gave that they turn off all the devices when leaving the apartment, or they only cool down selected rooms of the apartment, and it's all to save energy costs. Nevertheless, in summer, the family spends 10 times more money on electricity than in non-hot or in other months of the year. So in summer, they spend 700 renminbi a month for the electricity bill, and in other months, it goes down to 70 renminbi, despite their very conscious use of electricity. So some well-off parts of the population, they can afford permanent air conditioning of their apartments, and others, they have to consider more carefully whether, when, and where to use thermal devices. They would choose, for example, the electric ventilators, which use much less energy than the air conditioning devices, or many would also go and walk in public spaces or go to the cooled shopping malls. And also the hilly terrain of Chongqing offers some spaces to cool down. For example, under the bridges that crisscross the territory, we find a lot of green spaces and also little tea houses where people would go and sit and cool down outdoors. For the elderly with few financial means, Also, a social welfare program provides air conditioning devices for free, but still the running costs for electricity have to be paid by the residents themselves. So cooling down in Chongqing is accompanied by social justice implications related to the dependency on electricity for indoor climate control. To make the urban climate and electricity nexus even a bit more complex, I'd like to say a few words also about the winter situation, because not only in summer, but also in winter, electricity consumption has been rising in recent times. In winter, temperatures in Chongqing on the coldest days range between 5 and 7 degrees Celsius, which at first seems not that cold. But the experience of winter in Chongqing is largely defined by the lack of a heating system. So some of you or most of you who have lived in China may be aware of the heating divide. In the 1950s, the government divided the country into a heated north and a non-heated south. And this was mainly due to resources, because there were not enough resources to provide all cities with a central or district heating network. The cities that are located right below the line, namely Chengdu, Chongqing, Wuhan, Nanjing, and Shanghai, which are the most well-known cities in this area, they have these not that cold winters, but still it feels quite cold if the cold from the outdoors sneaks into the indoor. Keeping warm with electric devices in Chongqing is a luxury not all residents can afford. Many of my informants, they, instead of heating entire rooms or apartments, they would rather warm their bodies. And the most common means to do so is just to wear more clothes indoors than outdoors. So people would sit in their living rooms with the jacket because temperatures are just too cold to take the jacket off. And they also change into warm house clothes, such as pajama trousers or the frequently worn quilted indoor jackets. People also emphasize the warming effect of food, hot tea, or a warm foot bath to stimulate the blood circulation. But with electrification, of course, it became possible also to use electric heaters. Like here, this informant has an electric heater below the working desk, or another thing that is very commonly used is the little sun. It's an infrared heater that if you direct it towards your body, you get quite warm after a while, or yeah, it really radiates heat towards your body. I have another example of Wusung. He was living in an apartment, and we see marked in red all the thermal devices that he uses to keep warm in winter. So there are electric devices such as the air conditioner that you can also use in winter to produce hot air. He has an electric blanket in the bed that he would turn on before going to sleep, an infrared heater, here some more air conditioner, but he also uses other forms such as a thermos with hot water where he can pour tea every so often, or a blanket which is already prepared on the sofa. When he would sit there, he would like cover his legs with it. So a new trend or a very recent trend among the upper middle class is also the installation of electric underfloor heating. Here on the left-hand side, you see the installation of such a heating in an apartment. But actually, many people argue that winter in Chongqing is too short to make up for the cost of installment and maintenance of such a heating. One head of a heating installation company said that heating is not a necessity in Chongqing, but with the rising quality of life in Chinese cities, those who can afford it invest in comfortably warmed apartments. So even if electrification since the 90s has made warming through devices possible, the choice of such objects and devices also depends on the socioeconomic means to purchase them and the ability to pay for the related electricity costs. Other factors, of course, also intervene in how hot you would like to be. So factors such as age, gender, or personal experience also affect the possibilities of mitigating the cold. I call it great heating divide, has had drastic consequences for winter practices in this summer hot, winter cold zone. On the national level, it is very beneficial because the policy has saved energy costs and prevented carbon emissions. And this is also one of the reasons why no heating networks are being installed in the south so far. So it really saves, it prevents carbon emissions and contributes to achieving the goals of decarbonization. At the same time, it leaves in the cold indoors some 500 million people, covering 42% of the national urban building stock. So these people, they can keep warm either if they can afford it with a costly underfloor heating, or on the right-hand side, you see the quilted pyjama, which is still popular to keep warm. Now, coming to some concluding words. Actually, I have many concluding words, but they will all go a bit into a similar direction. Since the second half of the 20th century, the built environment in cities around the world has been shaped by the legacy of fossil fuels. So the energy that continues to flow through our pipes, grids, and power plants in the form of oil, gas, and electricity builds a framework for the materiality and maintenance of urban architecture. Burning fossil fuel has not only left traces in the urban climate in the form of heat and air pollution, but it is also characteristic for the built fabric. According to architectural historian Elisa Iturbe, architecture cannot address the causes of the climate crisis without recognizing carbon modernity as a continuous cultural and material foundation for building and form. Contemporary urban forms are closely related to the energy that fuels them. So if we think about the single family houses in the US suburban areas, or also in Europe, on the one hand, they create grid-like street systems which demand car mobility and also use fossil fuels. And at the same time, of course, the architecture itself, the materials, they consume oil and electricity and energy to provide for the daily performance. Other architectural forms of urban modernity, in particular the high-rise or the glazed facade, the air-conditioned indoors, and the large amount of construction materials being built into the urban fabric, they also use a lot of energy and create carbon emissions. So residents react to these architectural givens, let's say. If they live in these houses, of course, they have to develop strategies to keep warm and cool. And these strategies, they often depend on the energy infrastructure. The urban development in Chongqing in the last 4 decades has not only fundamentally changed the residential living conditions, but it is very symptomatic for indoor-outdoor relations at the beginning of the 21st century. While the trend has gone towards encapsulating in conditioned indoors, both in summer and in winter, the findings of the research group that I worked with in the last years clearly advocate for a stronger consideration of the benefits that outdoor spaces have for urban living. So we promote that we should challenge the existing notion of climate control for individual buildings by promoting synergy and coordination within the built fabric. We have investigated relations between architecture, climate, and society in 4 cities around the world. You see them named here: Cairo, Santiago de Chile, Geneva, and Chongqing. And we think that the urban thermal governance of the future would do well to combine insights from urban climatology, ethnography, and architectural design practice. Because modern architecture has failed to recognize the energy potentials of the outdoors, and it was always focused on creating closed indoors that can be heated up or cooled down, respectively. We think that on the one hand, we have to continue mapping and simulating climatic conditions, but these quantitative data have to be combined with qualitative data. For example, energy pricing, governmental infrastructure investments, and social expectations are as important as wind speed and humidity to understand the urban climate conditions. The recent debates on energy transition have given buildings new relevance in governing urban environments. My talk outlined this double relevance of buildings. So on the one hand, houses are shelters for indoor urban life, and they are places where people aim to make themselves comfortable. But on the other hand, buildings are very much embedded in these whole energy transition discourses, and they have a material relevance in the transition from fossil to non-fossil fuels. We talk about new insulation layers, sealed walls, and triple glass windows as bringing us out of the climate crisis. But our group advocates that we should also look at how practices are related to these materials and how we can change these practices in order to use less energy and produce less carbon emissions. Just a short quote, this double role of buildings has also been addressed by anthropologist Hannah Knox, who looked at urban climate governance in Manchester. And she said that with their twin role in cutting carbon emissions and continuing a biopolitical and neoliberal approach to governing the city, buildings acted then as a meeting point between what we might call a climatological form of governance and a biopolitical one. The close interdependency of architecture and energy infrastructure, which has become hopefully obvious when looking at electricity infrastructures for cooling, makes us aware of the fact that the urban built environment is inherently political, social, dynamic, and extending beyond its merely functional value. So relations between the indoors and the outdoors in the Anthropocene are multiple. Household energy consumption, in large part with climate control, has not only driven global climate change, but has also affected local urban climates. So the burning of coal needed to generate the electricity used for cooling and heating causes environmental effects in different places in the hinterlands, but also in the cities themselves. These findings imply that we can no longer conceive the urban climate as one that is exposed to the outdoors, to the seasons, and the indoor as an artificial shelter. But in fact, the indoors and the outdoors, the city and the nature, architecture and infrastructure, practices and policies are very much interrelated. So that's what I would call the circularity effect in urban climate research. Thank you very much for your attention and enjoy your Tangyuan. And also I'm looking forward to your comments and questions, which probably extend the content that I presented to you today. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you, Madlen. Excellent presentation you gave here with so many impulses and so many déjà vus for me, because I have been to Chongqing in the early 1990s as a student on my way up the Yangtze to Nanjing. And we had this great idea to jump on the boat. There was no Three Gorges Dam built yet, and go on the boat to Nanjing, which we did, through this beautiful landscape, which was gone after the Three Gorges Dam was built then. And I ate the hottest meals ever. I ate in China, in Chongqing. And I remember when we arrived in Nanjing, and there was in winter time, we put our feet in this tea water pots, not to get too much freeze in the winter times, because Nanjing was below this line and it was very, very cold in the winter. So thank you very much for these déjà vus. And I, as a political scientist and sinologist, have a first question maybe concerning the instruments of the government to regulate the urban energy consumption. You said